Everyone. Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us for the next hour as we discuss zombie development approvals. This webinar is an initiative of Nature Conservation Council, our peak environmental body in New South Wales, and Coastal Residents United, or CREW, a collection of activists and communities who are affected by zombie DAs. You'll find the link to their Facebook page in the chat. Sam's going to pop that in there for you. So I'm George Lowry. I'm the founder of Manana Matters. We're a grassroots environmental association that formed largely because the zombie DAs in our village, if seen to light, would double the size of our town. Our code of conduct at Manana Matters is simple. It's simply respect for self, each other, and everything. It strikes me that this is what our First Nations peoples lived by, respect. They are the masters of it, living harmoniously with nature for millions of years. They farmed the land and the oceans sustainably, taking only what they needed. They say, look after country, because I am country. I'm part of the ecosystem. And when I look after country, I'm looking after myself, my family, my people, and the future. In comparison, when I think about the damage white man has done to this land in just 235 years, I can only say I have immense respect for our Indigenous brothers and sisters. And I'm very grateful that they are still prepared to share their wisdom with us. You can feel free to give a shout out to the First Nations mob whose land you're on tonight in the chat, if you like. Manana is Geringer country, but the land I am beaming into you from tonight is in northeast Victoria, which belongs to the Tongurong people. So just a bit of housekeeping. As I said, this webinar goes for 1 hour. We have 4 guest speakers, but we'll keep things pretty tight. We have muted you all, and please do keep it on mute, otherwise it interrupts everything. So for smooth sailing, just sorry to mute you, but if you have any questions throughout the night, we would love to hear them. Please just enter them in the chat. You should also note that this webinar is being recorded so we can refer to it in future and share it when other people wonder what is a zombie DA. So a little bit about Manana Matters. You may have already heard of us. Just before Christmas 2019, Sydney developer Aussie Homes pegged out their zombie DA, 182 house lot subdivision on a 20-hectare forest at the edge of town. Then the Black Summer fires ripped through, decimating the 11,000-hectare Conjola National Park, which hugs our village. As we all know, and many online tonight were directly affected, many homes were destroyed and lives lost. And also billions of animals were killed. Well, the Currowan mega fire was not even extinguished when Aussie Homes announced that they were ready to bulldoze the forest. But our community was not having a bar of it. We just could not stand by and watch the last remaining refuge for any birds and animals that happened to escape the flames be destroyed. So despite COVID lockdown, we launched into action and started a campaign that garnered worldwide attention, beginning with yoga at dawn on the edge of that forest. 4 years on, and the Manana Special Conservation Reserve, as we prefer to call it, is still standing. But the Minister for Environment, Tanya Plibersek, is expected to hand down a decision on the fate of our forest any day. So that's us. What exactly is a zombie DA? Well, it's an approval for a substantial development, which is often a massive subdivision, but sometimes it's a commercial precinct, retirement village, or even a legacy zoning that dates back sometimes many, many years, even decades. If you're affected by one in your area, we'd love it if you share its age in the chat. Let's see who wins the unenviable title of having the oldest zombie in New South Wales. So unlike an approval for a private dwelling that you or I might wish to build, which must be completed within 5 years, a zombie DA never dies. It never expires. Its approval was often cemented by the flimsiest evidence of physical commencement, and it can be sold with that approval in place and brought back to life at any time without having to meet current planning and environmental standards. As we discovered, there's not even any mechanism in the current legislation whereby a zombie DA can be even temporarily pulled up, not even in extenuating circumstances like the catastrophic Black Summer bushfires or Lismore floods. So to speak about this tonight from the youth perspective, I'd like to welcome Neve Ockleshaw from Crunch Time at Tirra Beach. Thanks for joining us, Neve.
Thanks for having me. Hi, everyone. My name's Neve, and I'm based on the border between Thawa and Dirrangunj people of the Yuin Nation, here on the far south coast. I'm a member of a group called Crunch Time, which essentially started as a way for young people to have a voice and a space to discuss their concerns surrounding housing and environment. I'll start with a little bit of a story as to how I found out about my local zombie. It was during the 2019 to 2020 Black Summer bushfires. A lot of our local area, especially the Tirra Beach Merimbula coastline, was ravaged by fires and continued to be affected well past the early onset of 2020, as smoke and soot and ash continued to get into waterways and damage our ecosystems. During this time, a group of young people, namely two specifically, Jacob Shields and Juliet Fontaine, found out about a local zombie DA that has been approved 35 years ago. It was placed in a lovely patch of bush near Mirador on Tirra Beach, so that's why we call it the Tirra Beach zombie DA. And essentially what they found was a big fence erected on what is locally known as the Merimbula starhair, which is one of the rarest plants to be found in Australia. It only grows in 3 pockets of the far south coast, and a big fence had been erected directly on top of it. This got them going, essentially. It spurred Jacob and Juliet to create a space, and later Freya, myself, and another colleague called Poppy, to try and decide we needed action. We needed some way to get into this. Because we are young, in 2020, we were 16, 17. We didn't have a space or the tools or the knowledge to really understand what was happening or approach these zombies at even a local scale. So the ways we banded together to create Crunch Time itself was to give us the skills and possibilities to have a say. These zombie DAs have really affected how we find our local governments react to young people, and definitely how much we're pushed down in terms of our voice. So what we did was band together and try and come up with some solutions to come up with ways to help motivate and engage young people in this turbulence environment. So Crunch Time itself, Jacob and Juliet decided we need to upskill young people. We need to enable them and teach them and educate and make sure they're empowered to look at their own local areas, see if they've got any zombie DAs, and see what we can do about it. So what they ended up doing was a tour up the coast, visiting 6 different locations and engaging with as many young people as they could to show a short film that Jacob and Jordan had made about our local area. I strongly encourage anyone to go watch that. It's a really moving story from Jacob's perspective. And they traveled up the coast and put on workshops for a lot of young people, and they taught them what is a zombie DA, how their local parliament or council kind of works, and how they could possibly upskill themselves and tackle them. This kind of accumulated. They finished their tour and they came back down and they were like, this is not enough. We need to do more. And continuously throughout the development of Crunch Time, we've gained so many incredible people. We've worked together with the SGA, so the Social Justice Advocates, the YCAC, which is Youth Climate Action Group, Grow the Future. So many amazing people have joined our cause. And it all culminated into Crunch Time taking a busload of young people from around the coast. And we went on a pilgrimage of sorts up to the Sydney Parliament, where we got together some politicians and ministers and representatives of other kinds and sat them down, showed them the Chira Beach documentary, and essentially asked them questions and put to them some solutions that we had come up with. This was such a strong and empowering moment for young people from my area and up the coast. We got to meet so many incredible people, and we were riding such a high when we got to Parliament. And then we were there and we put our case to these politicians, and we got the same old blank or just defensive and evasive answers as we'd seen on TV or if we've read online and all that sort of stuff. And it was quite disheartening to have brought them all this evidence and these solutions that we had come up with that surrounded the intertwined crisis of housing and environments and encouraging people to live in small dwellings, enable secondary dwelling taxation and all this sort of stuff. And to see that shot down in Parliament was a disheartening reality. There's another film on that, or another short highlight reel on that I'd really encourage you to go see. So we decided that it needed some real just action from us. We weren't going to go politically. We decided to take a step back from the political movement and focus locally. So we came back to our local areas, we all dispersed, and we've been educating and sharing this kind of message towards everyone we can reach about zombie DAs and their importance. Now I'd like to speak a little bit about the effect zombie DAs have on youth as a perspective from the housing crisis, environmental crisis, and environmental anxiety that most of my generation holds. My local Chira DA, zombie DA, as I've mentioned, is 35 years in the making. And this was put through on decades-old legislation, and we've come so far in science, policies, education, and it's still, the fence is still there, the trees are still there, so that's a win as well. Seeing how Parliament or council can just disregard native forests to give way for unaffordable, inaccessible housing that is not affordable for young people, disabled people, disadvantaged people. It it truly makes us feel like we're not in the forefront of policymakers' minds when they put forward their decisions. And we decided, right, we're gonna do something about this properly. So that's also a massive part why the CRU groups are fantastic. We currently are lobbying for the endangered natives in our local area, especially especially the yellow-bellied glider, which relies on old growth trees with hollows and stuff, and long-nosed potoroos, and of course the marimbular starhare, which I mentioned. But this environment we are in right now is not coercive to spirited youth at the moment, and I hoped to inspire at least some of you, or your children, or your friends, or anything like that, to really find your zombie DAs and see what groups are opposing those, and see what you can do to maybe stem this action or put a halt to it. So that's kind of the perspective of my local youth, at least.
Fantastic, Neve. Really well said. Thank you so much for presenting that to us. We were really thrilled when Jacob and Juliet came up to Manana with their workshops, which stands for Youth Empowerment Sessions, if I remember rightly. It was just fantastic to engage the younger people, and out of that, really, we've got a youth side to Manana Matters. We've got like a youth subcommittee as well, and they go and do their thing and do things on that TikTok stuff that I don't even understand how that works. But anyway, that's their gig, and I'm glad they know what they're doing. Yeah, so it's horrible that you have had those negative reactions to all of your effort, but don't feel alone, because I think that's kind of how we often get treated. But you're spot on in saying to people, be aware of what zombie DAs are in your area and see how you can get involved, especially with Coastal Residents United. So tell us, how can people follow you? Do you have like a Facebook page or an Instagram or something?
Yep, so Crunchtime has a website, which is crunchtimeoz.org.au. We've got an Instagram, same handle, and obviously a Facebook group as well. Just one more thing to follow. Oh gosh, excuse me. It was quite disappointing to see the reactions of a lot of parliamentary and decision makers, but it was also incredibly empowering to find so many young people who were so engaged in this issue, and so many different groups that were ready to fight for this cause. So it is not it wasn't a complete waste, really. None of it was a waste to meet and empower so many amazing, incredible groups and young people. So it was all worth it.
Absolutely, and you're doing a fantastic job. I don't think these things are solved overnight. What I love about your group is that you're solutions focused. You know, you don't just whinge about the problems. You're like, what can we do about it? And yeah, so absolutely fantastic job. Thank you so much. Now, the next person that we have who's going to speak with us is Justine Emerson, and she's from the Environmental Defenders Office. She's going to give us a bit of a legal perspective on these zombies. And we at Manana Matters absolutely love EDO because, they helped us take our developer to court, and which resulted in us seeing this be made a controlled action. And honestly, the forest has stood for 4 years longer than it would have had they not stood by our side. So welcome, Justine.
Thank you. Now have got some slides, so I'm just going to share my screen now, just so you can, I'll bring those up. So hopefully everybody can see those now. So firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the Gamigal people and pay my respects to elders past and present, and I extend that respect to all Aboriginal people that have on this webinar this evening. So as George mentioned, the EDO is a community legal centre. Many of you probably are aware of the EDO. That's dedicated to protecting nature, climate and country. I'm the coordinator of the National Intake Program, which is a program that provides free legal information and advice to people who are seeking to protect the environment. So my team responds to a broad range of inquiries that relate to environmental and planning law from all over the country. On that note, I'd point out that this is legal information and shouldn't be relied on as legal advice. And whilst I've endeavoured to ensure the accuracy, if you'd like legal advice, then please feel free to make an application via our website. So George spoke at the start of the webinar about just what is a zombie DA, and there's no legal definition of what constitutes a zombie legacy or historic development. However, local communities do have very good reason to be concerned, as these developments generally don't comply with current planning and environmental controls. So we have received a number of inquiries from community members who are seeking advice on what they can do to protect their local environment from these resurrected developments. Unfortunately, there are very limited legal avenues available to stop these projects from going ahead. But what I want to do tonight is to address a few of the issues that you should consider when you're faced with one of these projects in your community. So the first question we get asked is, how are these development consents, which were granted, 10, 20, sometimes more years ago, still valid? Well, a development consent generally lapses 5 years after the date from which it operates, that is when consent was given. However, consent does not lapse if physical commencement has occurred. So what does physical commencement mean? Well, up until 1999, the test for whether a development consent had been initiated was based around substantial commencement. However, this was replaced by physical commencement, with the intention being to make it easier for developers to avoid the lapsing of consents. So physical commencement broadly requires that any building, engineering or construction work which relates to the development be physically commenced or started on the land to which the consent applies. Now, the criteria for this work that would satisfy these requirements under the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act isn't set out in the Act, although I should point out that there was an amendment in 2020 to the regulation, which now does exclude certain minor works. However, that regulation, that amendment would only apply to a development consent that was doesn't apply rather to a development consent that was granted before the 15th of May 2020. So when assessing whether physical commencement has occurred in relation to these zombie developments, it's necessary to look to the case law. So what have the courts said? Well, physical commencement is a question of fact, and it will turn upon the circumstances of each individual matter. Now, George made the point at the start also that, sometimes they're very, very minor works that have meant that you've got that requirement's been satisfied for physical commencement. But rather than trying to list the sort of works that the court has accepted as satisfying this provision, I'll just try to focus on a few of the factors that they'll take into consideration. So in that first case, Hunter Development Brokerage and Cessnock City Council, the court said that there must be a real nexus between the work that was undertaken and the approved development. So there is an element of fact and degree in each case, but it has to be real. It can't be a sham. So that's something to consider. The next point, which was made in the Cando Management and Maintenance and Cumberland Council case, which is important, although perhaps unsurprising, is that any works that weren't in accordance with the development consent are not considered to be physical commencement for the purposes of the Act. And thirdly, I thought it would be of interest. Many of you are probably familiar with the decision of Philip Rise and Kempsey Shire Council, which was quite a disappointing decision around whether soil testing that was undertaken at the site, I think it was in 1994, by a third party, satisfied the condition of the development consent. And the court said in that instance that the correct approach to the concept was not to ascertain why the testing had been undertaken, but to ask what had been sought to be achieved and whether the activity relates to the development consent. So when considering physical commencement, it's really important to understand what works have been undertaken at the site, what was sought to be achieved by those works, When were they undertaken? Was it within 5 years of that consent being granted? And were these works undertaken in accordance with the conditions of consent? Now, I do understand that this is difficult for community members to make this sort of assessment independently. And if you feel that physical commencement may be an issue, then we'd suggest you write to the council and ask them to set out why they believe the requirements under the Act have been satisfied and that the works were carried out in accordance with the conditions of consent. So let me now turn to the next issue that I think is worth contemplating, and that goes to the development consent itself. So you'd all be aware that the Act requires the consent authority to impose conditions on a development which must be complied with before the commencement of the works or during the course of the development. And it's worth exploring whether these conditions of a zombie development can still in fact be met. So we've had an inquiry involving a development application where the consent required that a property vegetation plan, which would have been issued under the now repealed Native Vegetation Act, be provided prior to the issuing of a construction certificate. Now, we've argued that the inability to comply with this condition of consent triggers a requirement for a modification application. And a similar issue was considered by the Land and Environment Court in a matter of Plume Commercial Contractors and Central Coast Council. Again, that also involved a property vegetation plan, which one of the conditions of consent required be obtained from the local land services in accordance with the Native Vegetation Act. Now, the Land and Environment Court found that it was no longer possible to comply with that condition. And the applicant sought the court's approval to modify the development consent by deleting that particular condition and replacing it with 2 new conditions, which required the applicant to submit a biodiversity development assessment report, which was in accordance with the Biodiversity Conservation Act. So I make this point because it is worthwhile seeking a copy of the conditions of consent and confirming that all the conditions have been complied with before a construction certificate has been issued. If you've got any questions or queries regarding this, then please reach out and we'll endeavour to assist. We've found that in a number of instances that we've seen that the initial approval for a zombie development has been made under the now repealed Part 3 of the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act, which a concept plan approval. So whilst Part 3A was repealed in October 2011, there are transitional provisions that still exist in the Environmental Planning and Assessment Savings Transitional and Other Provisions Regulation in 2017. So what that means is that where transitional provisions apply to a project, consent must not be granted under Part 4 of the Act unless the consent authority is satisfied that the development is generally consistent with the terms of the approved concept plan. Whilst there's no merit appeal rights generally available for development that involves residential subdivision, it may be possible to challenge the approval of a development application that's made under one of these approved concept plans if you can demonstrate that the DA was not consistent with that approved concept plan. Should just point out that an application for review must be filed within 3 months of the determination. And a judicial review, it is difficult, it's expensive, and ultimately it may not stop the project from going ahead. Frequently, concerns around development applications that were approved under a concept plan relate to the environmental assessment, which was undertaken in respect of the project, which were far more discretionary than are currently required. So zombie developments were approved prior to the introduction of the Biodiversity Conservation Act. However, again, there's these transitional provisions in place under the Biodiversity Conservation Savings and Transitional Regulation, which allowed a proponent to seek a Clause 34A certificate, which recognises past biodiversity impact assessment and offsetting arrangements that were secured as part of a concept plan approval. So where a Clause 34A certificate is in place, the biodiversity impacts of the development application are assessed under old provisions that were in place at the time. However, Clause 31 of that particular regulation does allow for a change in the status of a species, such as a new or altered listing of a species as being endangered under the Biodiversity Conservation Act, to effect a corresponding change in the listing under the Threatened Species Conservation Act, which is referred to in the form of planning provisions. So this provision may trigger additional assessment requirements under Section 5A of the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act if a species has been newly listed or the status of an existing listing has changed. If you think that may be the case, it's really important to obtain legal advice on the implications and whether these could be grounds for challenge. So I'll also highlight there is a provision within the current Act, Section 4.57, which does make provision for the Planning Secretary or the Council to revoke or modify a development consent. They have to have regard to a proposed environmental planning instrument, a SEP or a state environmental planning policy in the case of the Planning Secretary or the local environment plan in respect of a council. I'm not aware of any circumstances where this has been used. It may be worth seeking legal advice if you think this could possibly be relevant to see whether it applies in your circumstance. So finally, I want to talk about the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, which again, George mentioned at the start in respect of the manana zombie DA. There's nothing to exclude a zombie development from the operation of the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. So if a project is likely to have a significant impact on a matter of national environmental significance, such as a threatened species or a threatened or endangered species that's listed under the Act, it must be referred to the Commonwealth Department for assessment under the EPBC Act. And it's an offence to carry out a controlled action without approval. So whilst you can't directly refer a project for consideration, you can write to the State Minister requesting that they refer the project, or you can write to, or you can write to the Federal Minister for the Environment, asking that she call it in for assessment. It's important to identify how the project is likely to have a significant impact on one or more of these matters of national environment significance. A useful guide for this is the Significant Impact Guidelines, which are available on the Commonwealth Government website. It's also helpful to have scientific evidence which supports the assessment that it will or is likely to have significant impact. Now, if a project was previously referred and determined not to be a controlled action requiring approval, it is still possible to write to the Environment Minister to ask her to reconsider her decision if there is substantial new information about the impacts the project has or will have or is likely to have on a matter of national environmental significance, or there is a substantial change in the circumstances that was not foreseen at the time the first decision was made. There's no statutory timeframe to lodge a request for reconsideration. However, it should be made as soon as possible. George highlighted the case of the manana matters, in which case the EDO represented the group and the project was referred to the Commonwealth Department and a determination made that it was a controlled action for the purposes of the Act. I believe the decision has been extended into the 30th of April. So it may be an example of a success story where a community has successfully challenged one of these zombie DAs in an environmentally sensitive area. So what do we need to do? Well, clearly, the planning and environmental assessment framework that we've got in place at the moment is failing to protect our climate, biodiversity, or in fact, the health and wellbeing of our communities. And we think major law reform is required, which is starting with the Biodiversity Conservation Act and giving it primacy over competing pieces of legislation. So the key takeaways that I would say from the issues that you should look at is if you have a zombie development in your community, then ask the council to set out how the physical commencement requirements have been satisfied. Check if the conditions of consent can still be met. Check the DA is consistent with any approved concept plan. Check for any change in status of any threatened or endangered ecological communities that may be impacted by the development. See if the project is likely to have a significant impact on a matter listed under the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act? And if so, whether you can refer it or you can ask that it be referred to the Minister for assessment. And finally, lobby for stronger environment laws. Make a submission to the upcoming parliamentary inquiry. So a colleague said to me when I was talking about participating in this webinar this evening that this stuff is as dull as dishwater, but it is really, really important. So thank you all for the work that you're doing. If you'd like to find out more, please feel free to make an application for legal advice via our website, which I've got up there. And thanks again for the opportunity to participate.
Thank you, Justine. That was a lot of information to take in, but this webinar will be made available, the recording, to everyone who RSVP'd afterwards. So you can put it on slow motion and, you know, grab all the notes from your slides. That was wonderful information. So if people want to support the EDO, how do they go about that?
You can find out more information about the EDO's work. And as I said, make an application if you would like some legal advice or assistance in respect of a zombie DA in your area via our website. So you can Google the Environmental Defender's Office or go to www.edo.org.au. And there is a button that has legal resources, which may have some information that's relevant to this particular issue or other environmental issues, or you can make an application for legal advice via our website.
Lovely. And we have put that link in. I'm not quite sure that the link is working. Maybe we can test that. I can just see there's a bit of there's a percentage sign in there that I'm not sure is supposed to be there, but we'll test it anyway before the meeting or the webinar's done. But yeah, do support the EDO, everyone. We'd be lost without them. Fantastic job you guys do. So thanks again very much, Justine. So the next person we've got speaking is Councillor Alison Worthington. She's the Deputy Mayor of Eurobodalla Shire Council, and she's going to talk to us tonight about the council, you know, local council perspective on all of this. You know, what can they do? What information can we get from them? What help can we get from them? How do we approach them? That kind of thing. So welcome, Alison.
Thanks, George. And thanks everyone for the invitation to be here and for coming along tonight. I just want to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the lands of the Brinja people here on Yuin country, and thank them for their care of country and coast over so many thousands of years. I just want to also mention that I put a message in the chat a little bit prematurely early. I'll come back to that later. It does refer to the New South Wales parliamentary inquiry into these historical consents, which we also know as zombies. And I suspect James will touch on that, but I'm sure it'll come up in Q&A and your opportunities to make submissions to that. We do have zombies in our backyard here in the Eurobodalla Shire. We don't know how many we've got. So that's one part of the advocacy that a lot of councils are making to the state government, is to say you need to help councils audit how many of these non-lapsed developments, how many of these zombies we've got in our closets. I've asked our planning staff a number of times if they could unearth any others that are sitting there with or without physical commencement and significant commencement, that let's just say that are more than 10 years old, and they just sort of throw up their hands and say it's very hard, we don't know, we're not sure. And so if it is a really time-intensive piece of work, then we are certainly advocating to the state government that they should support all councils to go through, do that audit, so we know how many zombies we've got in the closet, and we're not in a situation that communities here and all up and down the coast find themselves in, which is that they don't know about the zombies until the earth-moving equipment arrives, or sometimes it comes up as a matter of council, as I'll explain happened in my situation with one of those in my part of the world. I do just need to mention that Anderson Avenue, also known as the Coiler development, it's also got a name that the developer's given, but I try not to use, Driftwood, is actually a matter before the Land and Environment Court right now. So I'll be taking care, that is that the Friends of Coiler group, who are known to anyone in the Coastal Residents group, have taken council have an appeal in the Land and Environment Court right now, a Class 4 appeal. Council is a first respondent to that, and the McCloy Group, the developer, is a second respondent. So I'm taking care to not really speak much to that particular issue today. What I will be speaking to just now is, look, the challenges for council and councillors with these zombies. The division it creates in our communities, I think unnecessarily. We should tidy this up. And of course, it's that constant challenge between balancing development and particularly housing and protection of the environment. I'll talk a little bit about the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act, not too much, and how it has actually come to prop up developer interests over people and place and care for country and even species that we know are on their way to extinction. And I'll speak about the things that you can do to get the right people into those decision-making roles on council, and how to both pressure and support your councillors to make good decisions in the face of these zombies, especially in the lead up to the local government elections this year. So just on that, I'm a first-term councillor. I was elected to Eurobodalla Shire and became deputy mayor in late 2021, and we started our work on council in February 2022. And right then and there in front of us was a zombie. This is the one that's before the court, so I'm just going to speak about it historically, about what happened to us when we came to council then. 1984 is when that consent was given by a council many, many terms before ours. And it's in a really beautiful location on the southern shores of Coiler Lake, and it will certainly impact on salt marsh, seagrass and other endangered ecological communities that have really been doing quite nicely in that area, while that parcel of land sat undeveloped, even though it had the development consent there. Council deemed that it did have significant physical commencement, and so did not need a fresh assessment. That was 38 years since the consent was granted. The developer did, however, put in a modification to the original DA, and that's why it came to council. They were actually asking to have more lots added to the original DA, and worked with our planning staff who rejected the original application to modify the DA, and ultimately our council approved the second version of a modification that they put through, and our staff assured us that it actually was going to develop better, give better environmental outcomes than the previous 1984 consent had done. So that was our silver lining, is how that was sort of put to us. I'm speaking about this because it comes to what I'll address about getting the right decision makers in there and supporting your councillors, and what we can do in an election year about that, because I was not the only first-term councillor in the room making those decisions at the time, and I certainly voted against that one, and asked my councillors to bravely challenge the decision to end up in court, if that's what it took, in the Land and Environment Court, by refusing the modification of the DA. And look, it is a bravery, a matter of bravery for new councillors and old, but we did have 7 out of our 9 councillors were first-term councillors, and one of the first big decisions that we had before us was this one. And we certainly didn't have the experience to deal with it, and we also were challenged with very strong advice from the professionals in the room, who are our staff and planning staff, and this big, you don't want to end up in court, councillors message. That will cost your ratepayers. Not a good move for first-term councillors, and I'm sure we were not the only councillors that were getting that message, and continue to get that message from our staff. You don't want to end up in court. But the court is actually a critical part of our democracy, and everyone has a right to go to the courts to seek justice, everyone. And the law, of course, should apply to everyone equally. So that's the first challenge for councillors, and I'm encouraging you as residents to support your councillors to remind them everyone has that chance to seek justice in the courts. And would you believe it? The Land and Environment Court is, in fact, a part of our planning system. I've got here the 2020 version of the New South Wales government's community guide to planning, but there is an updated 2023 version. It's very similar. And right here, when it says who does the planning, it lists the minister, the state agencies, the department, councils, accredited certifiers, planning panels, the Independent Planning Commission, and the Land and Environment Court. It's part of our planning system, and councillors should not be afraid to use it. So that's one of the ways that I would encourage you to support your councillors, to remind them that it's there to be used. The other thing that new councillors or all councillors struggle with is just finding that balance for their communities between the need for housing and development that often really does unacceptable damage to our environment and known endangered ecological communities. So we've got planning staff on the one hand telling us this will be fine, it meets all the conditions in our planning system, you don't want to end up in court, and don't you want more housing? Aren't we in a housing crisis? Come on, councillors. So I'm not really sitting here to say poor me, but I wanted to let people know that it's a juggle, it's a balance that councillors are always trying to make, and that's if they're fortunate enough to have these zombie developments actually come up before them. They don't always go that way. So I've touched a little bit there on the planning system as well, the fact that that's the system that we're in. I had the diagram there of all the parties that are engaged in it, involved in it. I'm told that in 1979, when that act was brought in, it was admired around the world for being, pioneering and the best you could find. Environmental Planning and Assessment Act. But what it's come to be is the Developers Act. It absolutely props up developer interests over those of communities. And we've seen, for example, I think Justine referred to recent changes that have come through at the state level around these developments that should be lapsed, where the language in the statements that come back about this sort of stuff, and it'll come up in the parliamentary inquiry that's open for submissions now, is all about developer certainty, that it's important that we ensure that developers have certainty about their investments, and it often comes up as being more important than the case that our communities are bringing to say that we really need to protect our coastal environments. I put in the chat, and I just want to remind you that's a 40-year-old zombie I'm referring to there.
Thanks, Alison. You mentioned the inquiry, the parliamentary inquiry, and a few people have mentioned that tonight. So the good news is that the Legislative Assembly are doing an inquiry into zombie DAs, and we'll put a link in the chat to where you can find out more information about that and how you can make a submission. You do have until June 3. And when we talk about a submission, that's such a scary word for a lot of people, but it's literally just saying, if you've got something to say about this, please go ahead and say it. And the more people that speak up, the better. So I guess my question for you, Alison, is these zombie DAs are running all the way along the coast, on the coastal fringe. And I think everybody knows that this ain't solving any housing crisis when the parcel of land itself, by the time it's cleared and set for a house, is more than any young person, as Neve explained earlier, can afford. I guess is that sort of something that councillors can argue that, because it's a bit of a red herring, isn't it? It's a bit of a, that people like to throw in there.
Yes, it is. And, councillors should be able to argue that a lot of these developments are not going to really contribute to solving some of our housing crisis issues. A development consent granted in 1984 is based on a pretty old kind of, the old way that we were doing subdivisions on larger lots with a lot of land and backyard, 3 and 4 bedroom homes. And look, in this shire in particular, we've done the assessment. We have a draft housing strategy coming out on exhibition soon that really paints a very clear picture that we do not need any more of that housing stock. In fact, we have close to an oversupply of that, and not enough of the 1 to 2 bedroom homes, units, etc.
In areas where it's central to services and public transport and hospitals and schools and so forth.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. I mean, we know that a lot of these zombie DAs are situated in areas where people are just going to build their holiday house or open, have an Airbnb or so forth. So yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us tonight. My understanding is that a lot of these, and certainly in the case of the Manana Matters zombie DAs, they all came under that major 3A, Part 3A major developments scheme that Frank Sartor approved way back in the 80s. And then so all of these areas were kind of pegged out for future development. So in the chat, it's the oldest zombie that we've got here is 40 years old, and of course things have changed. So it's great to sort of pre-plan. So the idea with those was that it took and correct me if I'm wrong, but it took the responsibility from council to state, and when it was changed back, it handed these legacy approvals back to councils to have to kind of clean up the mess.
Yeah, and the mess is not just in the approval process, it's also about the legacy of what we're left with. Well, certainly with developments that are sitting there with just a little bit of physical commencement. And also from up and down the coast, I've heard from other councillors who are finding that, of course, because they're old consents, these housing developments are happening on parcels of land that should never be developed, really sensitive environments, especially these flood-prone areas. So we end up in a situation where who's going to bear the costs for drainage disasters? And it's already happening. I know that Kempsey Council are already battling this. Nobody wants to own responsibility for why this land isn't draining well, and it's causing flooding issues in existing housing areas, in the new housing areas. Sediment running off the next subdivision that's already underway under construction is impacting on those 4-year-old subdivisions, and nobody sort of really wants to pick up the cost and the tab for these dreadful drainage and actual flooding outcomes.
Well, now we all know why the buck keeps getting passed whenever we approach, no matter what level of government. Thank you. So now we have James Barry, who's going to speak to us, and James has led a campaign up at Brunswick Heads. It's called Save Wallam. James is an ecologist, but he's also a champion campaigner. So welcome, James.
Thank you, George. Thank you, everyone, for having me. I will, give a little bit of a rundown, and then we can maybe make it a little bit interactive as we go. Something that I want to just highlight straight away in this process is that we knew nothing about zombie developments before this started. We knew nothing about zombie zoning. All we knew is that something was wrong. And we had to go hunting for what was the legislative cause for that feeling that something is wrong. And then from that, when we started to figure out, okay, so there is something wrong. There is something that's not quite right with the process that's occurred to get this zombie development into place, in this case being the Wallam subdivision. And that then took quite an interesting journey of educating ourselves and then being willing to educate others. So a term that I use, kind of ironically, being the construction term, is the term of scaffolding. So I pull that out of nervous system work. When I'm not doing environmental stuff, I'm doing craniosacral therapy and nervous system support. So scaffolding is a thing where you look at someone's trauma story, you look at someone's needs and experience, and you scaffold resources around that. And so what I realized really early on in my early attempts and the attempts that we continued thereafter was efforts to engage the community and to get the community to then engage with the council, to get them to engage with the levels of government, and to understand these really bizarre and boring processes. We needed to scaffold. And so I'll probably mention that word a few times and try to relate that into this space, because that really was the key component to getting across the board connection from the community to what was happening. And so I say that in the context that we had some brilliant ecologists with an incredible amount of knowledge that have been fighting the particular zombie DA that we're working against for the last 20 years. David Millage has been working on it for 20 years independently. And the brilliance of him, the brilliance of David Rawlins, Andy Baker, David Newell, so many high-profile expert ecologists that are weighing in against the DA in its early forms, against the concept plan when it came in 2013. Those voices, despite their brilliance, weren't heard and weren't heeded and were disregarded. And so it really was that at the 11th hour, because when I started this, it was the 1st of September and bulldozers were due on the 11th of October, and they still haven't made it onto that land. So that's I'll speak more to that story yet, but it was really that capacity to be willing to be patient and talk to each other and think about what does it take for people to understand this process? Who would I be if I deconstructed my understanding of zombie developments, if I deconstructed the acronyms, if I started to just speak in a way that honored and supported and believed in the intelligence inherent in my community, the belief that they want to engage, and that the doorway for engagement there could be the ecology, it could be the cultural values, of which were quite rich in this instance. And we had this like really interesting situation where the original ecological assessment body, being James Warren Associates, still JWA, had advised to the original developer, who's since sold it to the current developer, that they drain the site by straightening the creek and that they slash the heath. So in this case, it's a coastal heathland ecology. And yeah, they went and drained it, straightened the creek down the middle. They now call it a drain, and they even intend to move that drain, which is full of thousands of Wallum froglets, threatened species. And they continued over 20 years to slash it every second year. The irony of that being that it mimicked a mechanical form of fire. So that meant that it actually kept the seed bank of the Baronias and the Apacris and the Poltoneas. It actually kept it in circulation, whereas the surrounding areas were swamped out by other species. So yeah, we're dealing with a really interesting situation, and it's it's part of this zombie DA complex, part of this zombie zoning complex, and we really lent heavily into the support of people like George, who's here hosting this with NCC tonight, and Sue Higginson, who I believe is on here as well. So those people were incredible resources, and it's really just, yeah, there are resources out there, and there's lots of different support, but it's really being able to connect to actual humans around the issue and being able to ask questions and have accessibility. That accessibility was the thing that enabled us to really start to unpack it and understand it. So thank you, George, and thank you, Sue. And also Christina Webster, who very early on was a huge support in our campaign and was the main instigator of the idea that we would do a zombie march. And so that's something I would want to encourage anyone who's engaged in the zombie DA and zombie zoning process is to, if you can, just get a little bit silly about it. If you have like a local comedian or you're willing to get dressed up yourself, it's actually a lot easier than I thought it would be to get dressed up as a zombie. It's just a bit of eyeshadow and some
Sorry, I'll be back in a minute.
some white face paint and ripping up some clothes and just being willing to yeah, walk around like someone woke you up at 3 a.m. and then having placards and signs. And that was our initial, like we did that with about 25 people. And that was back when we had a support base of about 600. We now have a support base of 6,500 people online. And we have, thanks to a great deal of community work, 1,000 people ready to go for a red alert system. We don't know how all that's going to go on the ground when the bulldozers finally make their way closer to the gate. But yeah, we recently had another zombie march, which was organized, I think, in all of about 3 days, and we've got quite a few people to come to that. And what I'm trying to say, I guess, is, yeah, numbers is a great thing in those processes when you're doing a protest, and it's really helpful if that happens. But even with smaller numbers, we were able to create some energy around it, and that's what matters. And we try to feed it into the bigger picture. So even as we found ourselves getting, you know, with so many times through this process, doors that have seemed open that we've gone for with helpful leather have just shut and shut and shut and shut and shut, and we've had to just pivot and realign so many times. And that takes personal scaffolding as well. That takes being able to take yourself back out of that situation and try to decentralize leadership processes so that we can all be connected to what's going on. But that then, in this instance, linked back to scaffolding, being patient with the community, being willing to explain things. So that would look like, in a really practical sense, I would make a Facebook post and I would step things out, and then I'd be there ready and waiting. And I'd love heart every comment that came in and try to move all of that stuff around so that people felt heard and understood. And if you're willing to engage in the social media space, I'd really recommend, you know, check in with yourself if it can be actually a genuine process for you, because that actually matters. People will feel if it's not. And I had the resource and the willingness at the time to go in and really genuinely connect to what people were saying and reply with either like a thanks or reply with a, this is how you can get involved. And I was really lucky to have an ever burgeoning and growing team that was coming in to help. And that they were able to do that because of the scaffolding. They were able to find a place because we made it as safe as we could. And so in the context of what it meant to create a kind of community engagement and a community interest, that really came down to something that I sort of heard from the ether, I suppose. I was just like, I should just photograph this stuff. I should just take little films of it. And I'll just post that up, and I'll make a commitment to myself that every week I'll get on there and I'll post something about the trees and something about the heath. And let's just see if people can get engaged. And what I didn't anticipate, and what I want to, you know, pass on as an opportunity for us all to consider when we're working with these things, is the success of our campaign lent so heavily upon the imagery that started to appear. So what I'm saying there is my imagery was just on an iPhone 12. It wasn't particularly professional, but it was clear enough. And it was, you know, I'd match it up with music sometimes, and I'd match it up with meaning. So that was enough where I would, you know, I'd write into the reels, the Facebook reels, the Instagram reels, what it is you were going to lose, what it is we want to say, and kept it really simple. And then I'd detail more intensely in the description. And then I'd copy all of that description and then copy it all into the 20 or 30 local interest groups that were also on Facebook. And so every week, another 100 people would come in, another 100 people, and I would do that a couple of times a week to keep that engagement going. And that seemed to bring in more and more people that were increasingly interested. But the beauty of that was it started to bring in professional photographers. So they then took what I'd started in that larval form and turned it into a fully fledged frog, and they were getting in there, and they all had their own specialty. So and they just figured that out themselves. It wasn't particularly directed. One of them did mostly the flowers, the other one the trees, another one would do these cryptic insects, another one would do the birds. And they all started to work together. And at the start, it was a bit of a competition. And I remember some of them saying, like, I'd get out on the site regularly and I would chat with them, and someone would be like, oh, so-and-so's, like, Mac's already posting so much stuff, I'm not posting my stuff anymore. And I was saying, hey, actually, politicians are watching this space, and
there's room for everyone.
There's room for everyone. It doesn't
everyone
matter.
and everything.
Yeah,
Hey,
absolutely.
James,
Yeah.
thank you so much.
welcome.
We are running over time. You
Okay,
guys
that's
have,
good, because I was worried I wouldn't have enough time.
you guys have come up with some really fantastic, innovative ideas. And, you know, if anybody is looking for ideas on how to push their campaign, like the lightning speed at which you guys gained numbers, your ideas like block printing your protest t-shirts on site with the BYO shirt. I mean, just fantastic stuff. Great work. So if you could let people know in the chat how they can find you on Facebook, Instagram, whatever, that would be great. Anyone who's in that area up at Brunswick Heads. So you touched on something interesting as well. You said that the power is with the numbers, it's with people. And I reckon that is our one superpower. In some ways, it's kind of all we've got. It's numbers and unity. And everybody does have something to offer, every campaign. So our call to action, like to sum this up tonight, is do look up your local Coastal Residents United group, your local action group. Do go to your local council and ask them if they know of any zombie DAs in your area. That's actually what I did before I purchased my house in Manana, and found out that there were 4 of them. Then do also jump onto that Legislative Assembly inquiry. That's really important, and talk about it on social media. Share it with people, have the conversations around the dinner table, and make sure that people do comment on that. Join Nature Conservation Council, support EDO, and you know, if you don't have the time, maybe you've got some money, throw some money at any of these groups actually, so they can continue the work. Now, Nature Conservation Council have also just launched an e-petition. Because we're out of time, I'm not going to read it out, but there's a link to it now in the chat. Go there, have a read of it, and if you agree with those sentiments, please do sign that petition. Sue Higginson, I know from the Greens, is also doing an email campaign. So we have a lot of people. There are even more people doing things. So there's lots of ways you can have a voice and help. I think that's pretty much all we have time for. Feel free to reach out to any of us if you've got some specific inquiries. We'll help you as best we can. And thank you so much for coming tonight.
Thank you, George. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, George. Thanks, Sam, for pulling it together.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.